Okay, hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the 2023 Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series. It's lovely to see such a big and diverse audience calling in from all over the world tonight, and a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for Northern Studies, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these seminars. And for those of you who are veterans of these seminars, you'll know that this is the part where I recite my couple of technical points before we go any further and before I introduce tonight's speaker. The first point I just need to remind everyone of is that tonight's session is being recorded and will be available on the Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel. So if you want to relive the whole experience again, you can do so at your leisure. The second and final point I need to make clear is about questions to the speaker, and you're more than welcome to submit questions at any point during the presentation tonight. I would just ask that you do so via the chat function rather than the Q&A function, because the chat is just easier to maintain and allows me to keep an eye on things and make sure nothing slips through the cracks. Now, one of the many perks of organising these seminars is that I occasionally get to invite along one of my pals to give a paper, and tonight is one such occasion, and it is my great pleasure to welcome my friend and former colleague, Dr. Simon Egan. Dr. Egan graduated with his PhD from University College Cork in 2016 before holding a research fellowship from the Society for Renaissance Studies, followed by the Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship which he held at the University of Glasgow. At the end of that fellowship in 2020, Simon took up a lectureship at Trinity College Dublin before moving over the border to Queen's University Belfast last year. Simon's research focuses on Ireland and Scotland during the late medieval period, especially the political and cultural links which connected these two regions. And it's that very topic which Simon will be discussing tonight in his paper entitled Ireland, Scotland and the Wider Gaelic World, Rethinking the Paradigms. A very warm welcome to you, Simon.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Andrew. And it's great to be here, and thank you for the invite. Okay, so as Andrew mentioned, the PowerPoint can be a little bit slow. So I think if Andrew, if you wouldn't mind, if things go drastically wrong and I can't see it, just let me know and I can retrace my steps.
Sure thing.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so today's paper, I'd like to talk about the wider Gaelic world as it existed in the pre-modern period. So we'll say before the 17th century. I want to talk a little bit about how we've approached this topic, talk through some of the various approaches to, how historians, how scholars have approached this idea of a wider Gaelic world. We could probably define the wider Gaelic world as, it's a shorthand term. Now, I would say at the very beginning, not everyone accepts this designation. There's a lot of debate about that. That's what I'm going to talk through tonight and talk about, why historians maybe think of it in such a way and maybe how we could go about thinking about it in different ways. So anyway, this kind of idea of a wider Gaelic world, anyway, it's often used as a shorthand term for the Gaelic-speaking regions, or Gaelic-speaking, and I'm just going to say Gaelic because I grew up saying Gaelic, the Gaelic-speaking regions of Ireland and Scotland, and you could probably put in the Isle of Man into that context as well. But generally speaking, wider Gaelic world refers to Ireland, the Gaelic parts of Ireland, the majority of the island, and the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and the Northern Highlands as well. Okay, so it's not a fixed entity by any means. It's quite fluid. And I'll be talking mainly about kind of the medieval and early modern periods, mainly kind of 14th, 15th and 16th centuries tonight, but I'll also make reference on occasion to the 17th century and maybe go back a little further, a little earlier as well. We'll talk about maybe the 12th century in some cases. And I think it does make sense to take this very kind of wide chronological, wide geographic lens when talking about this very complex relationship, the relationship between the constituent parts of Ireland and the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the western section of the Atlantic archipelago, if you like. Now, needless to say, the idea or the debate surrounding the idea of a wider Gaelic world has proven very controversial. Historians can't really agree on the terminology. for very good reasons. They often can't agree on what constituted geographically. Is there an equal relationship between Ireland and Scotland? Should there be an equal relationship between Ireland and Scotland in this period? It really is a historiographical and geographical conundrum for a lot of scholars, with good reason. There are various factors shaping this, and I would, I suppose, start by boiling it down to two main schools of thought with regards to the study of the wider Gaelic world, or maybe how historians conceive of this. So that there's two main schools of thought, I would say anyway. There's a traditional school, if you like, a group of scholars who have argued for the existence of a wider Gaelic world, or a greater Gaelic world historically. So the argument that this entity existed in the pre-modern period, and the people living within that entity or that cultural sphere understood it as such. Okay, that's one strand of scholarship. A second and more recent strand, well, it kind of evolved in tandem with the first strand, I would call a revisionist school. Several scholars here have challenged this assumption. They've presented a far more complicated state of affairs, and broadly speaking, and I'll talk about the approaches in a little bit more detail shortly, this second strand has, they've argued they would favour a divergence between Ireland and Scotland, a significant divergence in the pre-modern period before the 17th century. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Okay, excuse me. So what is it I actually want to focus on today myself? What do I hope? What is my argument? What am I hoping to get out of this paper? What am I hoping to kind of to share with you? Broadly speaking, and I have touched on this a little bit already, I want to examine and discuss some of the approaches to this topic. I think it's important, it's worthwhile spending some time focusing on how historians have, how they understand this area, why they view this area in a particular way. I mean, there's been a huge, you can pick up the main history books on, let's say, medieval or early modern Britain, and oftentimes the relationship between Ireland and Scotland is in the last chapter, at the very end of that chapter. Okay, so it's very much pushed to the fringes of historiography. That's starting to change a little bit now in the last few years, thankfully. But broadly speaking, in kind of mainstream historiography, historical debate on the archipelago in the pre-modern period, it still occupies a very fringe position, if you like. So again, I think it's worthwhile actually discussing, centering that Irish-Scottish relationship and talking about that in more detail. So again, talking about the various approaches to this topic, what kind of scholarly consensus has emerged in the last few years regarding Ireland's relationship with Scotland, or indeed has a scholarly consensus emerged? I think both schools I mentioned, they have their own separate consensus. Sometimes it's in dialogue with one another, more often it's not. So again, that's something I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. Could we do anything differently? Is there anything missing from this debate which we could pay a little bit more attention to? Is there anything that would add greater detail to the debate? Is there anything that would complicate it or problematize it in any more detail? So that's something. I have a couple of case studies I'd like to mention, talk about it in some detail, which I think personally I've started to do a little bit more research on these. I think they do add something to this debate. Kind of building on that then, are there any areas or dynamics in Ireland's relationship with Scotland that have been neglected? Do scholars prioritise certain topics, certain areas of research? Is there anything that has been overlooked or neglected? And I suppose, like I said, I'm going to survey some of the main debates, some of the main scholars and their arguments on this topic, first of all. In the first half of the paper, I suppose. In the kind of second half, last third of the paper, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm most interested in, and that is dynastic and political connections. That's what I think we really need to focus on and pay more attention to. Okay, I think again, there's been some fantastic work done on the Hiberno-Scottish interface, but I think it's mainly being through a cultural prism rather than a dynastic or a political one. And I think if we pay more attention to these dynastic and political connections, we can learn a lot more about the evolution of the Hiberno-Scottish interface. And it is something that evolves over time. There are changes in Ireland and Scotland's relationship throughout we'd say from 1100 right down to the dawn of the 17th century. But again, I think, looking at it through a cultural lens alone tells us just one side of the story. The political dynastic links are very, very important as well. Okay, so let's have a look at what I would call the traditional school, the traditionalist in some respects. Again, this school was but it's construct, it's historiographical construct, I suppose, is what I would. This is how I understand the area myself. This is how I've been able to categorize the various debates. But again, the first person to really talk about the wider Gaelic world in any kind of meaningful sense was Professor Stephen Ellis, retired from National University of Ireland, Galway, a couple of years ago. And Stephen Ellis, he published this article in Irish Historical Studies. I think even to today, it remains one of the most read pieces in the journal. It was a very important piece. It was the first, I suppose, major statement that we should be paying more attention to this dynamic, the evolving Irish-Scottish interface. And he had several core arguments within that piece, which I'll outline now. Again, he argued for the existence of a Gaeltacht. Now, in some respects, he asserted the point rather than argued it. Okay, but he did claim that yes, there was a Gaeltacht, a continuous, unbroken culture province, if you like, that extended from Mizenhead in the southwest of Ireland all the way up to John O'Groats in kind of northeastern Scotland, northern Scotland. And that was his core point he tried to make in that piece. He also argued that the Gaelic peoples of Ireland and Highlands and Islands of Scotland, that they viewed themselves as ethnically distinct from, let's say, the Lowland Scots and the English. And he also made some claims around the idea of sovereignty within this world, and that the people, the Gaelic communities within Ireland, within the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the nobility therein, they aspired to a greater Gaelic or a shared Gaelic sovereignty. So they understood this idea of Gaelic sovereignty, claims to have territory, etc., within this kind of pan-Gaelic context. And they were his kind of core main arguments, if you like, within that piece. Now, again, the article was really important because it underlined the importance of paying closer attention to Irish-Scottish connections in the pre-modern period. However, it assumed a unity and an integrity which may not have existed. Okay, and that's something we'll talk. The people have challenged him on that, but again, his main thing was we need to pay more attention to what's going on here. But he did assume an integrity, a unity, which may or may not have existed. The piece is also very Anglo-centric in outlook. Okay, so it focuses on the expansion of English and, I suppose, nascent British power in the archipelago from kind of the later 15th, early 16th century onwards. So again, it looks at the expansion of English power and Gaelic decline. So again, it's very much, the Gaelic world is very much viewed in terms of state formation, which is kind of, it's a little bit problematic. Again, I'm not going to get into a massive amount of detail on that because we could be here all night otherwise. But again, it's very much somewhat deterministic, if you like, the approach there. Now, he also made the claim that the Gaelic Irish, the aristocracy in Ireland, were inherently weak from a military point of view, and that the collapse of the Gaelic Irish order, if you like, was inevitable in the face of the expanding Tudor state. Okay, I will return to that shortly. Now, this model, this way of thinking about the Gaelic aristocracy in Ireland and kind of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, that has proven very popular within Irish and British historiography. So again, if you go back to those textbooks I talked about, the idea is that the medieval, early modern Britain, you'll have a chapter on the Irish-Scottish interface, and usually this article is cited as the main evidence for within that section, within those chapters. So again, it has had a very significant impact on historiography in kind of Irish and British academia. Okay, now Christopher McGinn took this idea a little bit further in some respects in his article Gaelic Ireland's English Frontiers in the Later Middle Ages, and he had this to say: the common language, legal practices, culture and sense of history lent the Gaeltacht a cohesion greater than that shared by, say, the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire in the same period. Now again, that's a statement. That's not, that wasn't based on a sustained comparative analysis of, is the Gaelic world more coherent than the Holy Roman Empire, or it was a statement. So the idea is it's kind of been accepted that this cultural integrity among some historians and scholars, not all, except more so in Irish academia than Scottish academia, I think. Now, I will return to this idea of a Gaeltacht. Is there any historical basis for it later on? Now, in terms of challenges to this this way of thinking about pre-modern Ireland and Scotland, Ellis's thesis has been in recent years in particular, it's been heavily criticised within the historiography of Tudor Ireland. So again, he viewed the Irish aristocracy as inherently weak, militarily incapable of combating the English state. Recent year scholars have placed there's much more emphasis on the vibrancy of the Gaelic Irish order, the Gaelic Irish aristocracy, and their ability to push back against the state, okay, to resist it effectively throughout the 16th century. I think one of the main statements to come out was 6 years ago, James O'Neill's The 9 Years' War, which he demonstrated how the Irish aristocracy very easily adapted to the latest military innovations in Ireland. And I mean, up until really Battle of Kinsale in 1601, it is all to play for in Ireland. And so again, this idea of Irish weakness is kind of finally been put to bed. But what about the Scottish dimension? What about the actual, Ellis's arguments about the links between Ireland and Scotland? Well, let's have a look at the revisionist school and how they have interpreted these arguments about a wider Gaelic world. And I think it's fair to say that his approach has not been well received within Scottish academia. I think that's fairly safe to say. Again, it's been heavily criticised, his ideas on the links between Ireland and Scotland in this period. And I suppose the first major rebuttal of Ellis's arguments came from Professor Wilson MacLeod at Edinburgh in his fantastic book, Divided Gaels, Gaelic Cultural Identities in Scotland and Ireland. He explored this idea of cultural integrity in more detail, and very much focusing on the bardic poetry of the period. His major conclusions are, as far as I understand it, are as follows. This idea of an unbroken cultural province extending from the southwestern tip of Ireland all the way up to John O'Groats, that does not really hold up to scrutiny. There's very little evidence to support this kind of idea of an unbroken cultural province. Looking at the bardic poetry, Wilson MacLeod argued as well that Ireland, if such a greater Gaelic world had existed, that Gaelic Ireland was very much the cultural heartland of the Gaelic world. Okay, if it had existed, Gaelic Ireland was the heartland. Scotland was the poorer cousin. Okay. This is looking through the poetry and how the poetry discusses the relationship between Ireland and Scotland. Okay, so Ireland, the heartland, perhaps the wealthier partner in this relationship. Scotland, occupies the place of the poorer cousin culturally. Okay, so you have a huge outpouring of literature from Ireland in this period, in classical Irish, early modern Irish. You don't have the same, anywhere near the same level of outpourings in Scotland. So the idea of one greater Gaelic world is perhaps anachronistic, according to Professor MacLeod. And we're beginning to see divergence in Ireland's relationship with Scotland, really from kind of the 13th century onwards, and it intensifies the more the Irish interact with the Tudor state, and the more the nobility in the Highlands and Islands interact with the Stewart state. Okay, so divergence is what we're seeing. From a cultural point of view, again, Wilson MacLeod, he was mainly talking about the cultural dimension here. Martin McGregor kind of explored the theme of sovereignty and political integrity, if you like, in more detail in this book chapter. So he looked at the politics of, not so much politics, the political culture, perhaps, in a little bit more detail. And his major conclusions were, and Martin has written several really interesting pieces on this. I've just highlighted one particularly pertinent article here, book chapter, sorry. He argued that the Gaelic world was a chimera. It was a construct. It didn't exist. It was something that was the Tudor administration, Stewart officials worried about developments in the western part of the archipelago. They kind of what am I trying to say? The Gaelic, a kind of a greater Gaelic world, a threat existed in their minds, whereas in reality it didn't exist at all. Okay. Then points to, leading within Gaelic Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, leading families such as the Campbells, the Earls of Argyll, they viewed themselves as leading members of the Scottish political community. Okay, so for people like the Campbells, who are great Gaelic lords, some of the most powerful Gaelic lords in Scotland, they saw themselves as being Scottish and Gaelic, but Scottish. They didn't identify with, let's say, a pan-Gaelic identity or a pan-Gaelic vision of in that sense. So this idea of a Gaelic political identity, a pan-Gaelic political identity, carries little weight in Martin McGregor's analysis. And Scottish Gaels, they would have identified maybe with a Scottish Gaeltacht or Gaeltacht rather than a pan-Gaeltacht that included Ireland. Okay, so again, suggesting that this goes to support MacLeod's argument that you do have divergence in this period. Okay, so Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland are drifting further and further apart politically, culturally, and also in terms of kind of political culture. But the argument is still very much, we're still kind of talking about cultural ideas here, culture rather than hard dynastic politics. Okay. So Anuas McCreinick, another former colleague of mine from Glasgow, wrote a very interesting piece for Scottish Gaelic Studies, where he examined the literary culture within the Highlands and Islands in more detail in the later medieval and early modern periods. And he placed special emphasis on Gaelic learning there. Okay, so what kind of levels of learning exist? What's the evidence for learning in Gaelic, writing in Gaelic, surviving documentation in Gaelic? And there's not much. Okay, compared with Ireland, very little survives in the context of the West Highlands and Islands. So, for example, in Ireland, thousands of bardic poems and a huge corpus of genealogical, legal, and analytic material has survived. It's really substantial what survives in an Irish context. That doesn't really survive in a Scottish context. There's a couple of documents written in Gaelic or early modern Irish, and there's the Book of the Dean of Lismore, a compendium of bardic poetry from the early 16th century. So there's a huge discrepancy in what survives in terms of vernacular Gaelic material from Ireland and Scotland. Instead, in Scotland, that dearth of vernacular Gaelic material is offset by an abundance of Latin and Scots material, charters, that kind of legal material. Okay, so again, McCunny could argue that there is more emphasis placed on Latin and Scots as languages of officialdom. Obviously, as a spoken language, Gaelic or Gaelic is very, very important, but in terms of interacting with officialdom, Latin and Scots are the main language. So again, that does raise questions about the cultural relationship, how it's skewed very much in favour of Ireland in terms of the sheer levels of literary outpouring from Ireland, raise questions about what kind of relationship that both regions have. Okay. I'd just like to highlight a couple of other really notable scholars here who have explored other aspects of this cultural relationship. So Maura Herbert, really famous Celticist from, and again, another former colleague from Cork, wrote about developing identities in Ireland in kind of, say, the kind of high medieval period, the early to high medieval period, post-Vikings, pre-Normans. And again, Herbert would have argued that yes, there is a sense of a Gaelic people that encompasses Ireland and Scotland, but Irish identity becomes increasingly linked with geography. So over time, the Irish self-identified, the Gaelic people living in Ireland self-identify with their own insular framework, their own insular context, if you like. So it becomes increasingly, the Gaelic people in Ireland become Irish more, they self-identify more as Irish islanders, if you like, than being part of a greater Gaelic world. Okay, and Maura Herbert is talking about the, again, pre-Norman period, so kind of before MacLeod, MacGregor, or MacHinnick. It's before their period. So again, pointing to perhaps divergences again in that cultural relationship. Again, my current colleague, Professor Micheál Manin, has talked about this relationship as well. And he's made a very good point, and this is something that I'll return to again later on. Again, ancestry is important here. So the Highland and Island Scots, they were Gaelic in ancestry. Okay, so again, an ancestry is very important in your identity here, a genealogical identity. This is a lineage-based society, as is pretty much the entire pre-modern world. So ancestry is really, really important. But again, he makes a good point that the Gaelic peoples in the Highlands and Islands, they understood themselves as being Gaelic in ancestry, so having an Irish ancestry, but Scottish, they consider themselves Scottish in terms of their nationality. And there is no inherent contradictions in this worldview. It's possible to be a Gael and a Scot at the same time. Okay, so that's important. Again, he also underlines the evidence in the bardic poetry. Scotland, throughout the 1200s, right down into the mid 17th century, perhaps even beyond, there is a strong affinity with Ireland culturally. Okay, so that is important. So again, yes, I think Micheál's point, the main argument, I think the most important thing to take from that article is that the cultural relationship, it becomes more complex. Okay, you do have divergence, but it's not complete divergence, it's complex. Okay, so just to kind of summarize some of that, a new picture begins to emerge in the last couple of decades. These debates have given us kind of a new vista, if you like, of Ireland's relationship with Scotland. And I suppose we can sum it up as just looking at those debates. The idea of a greater unbroken Gaeltacht stretching all the way from County Kerry all the way up to Inverness and beyond is questionable at best. It's questionable, okay? We've got a far more complex, variated state of affairs from the kind of the revisionist school, if you like, than maybe what Stephen Ellis set out to argue. That has changed considerably in the last 20 years. Now, these approaches, the revisionist school in particular, they do offer fascinating insights into this Irish-Scottish relationship, but, and I would say that this is kind of what I'm focusing on here, the focus has mainly been on cultural and literary divergence, okay? Little enough attention has been given to the hard dynastic political connections that underpinned Ireland's relationship with Scotland. Okay, so that's something I want to focus on in just to look at a few examples for the remainder of the paper and talk through them. Now, there are a couple of exceptions who I just mentioned briefly. There has been some work done, and some really good work on the political relationship between Ireland and Scotland. So again, G.A. Hayes McCoy, former professor of history in Galway, wrote a very good book, Scots Mercenary Forces in Ireland. It's nearly 100 years old now, but it still remains the standard text for Scottish interaction with Ireland. It's still the standard monograph, so it kind of needs a bit of updating there, I think. Jane Dawson's, this is one of the best books on kind of British and Irish history, period, to my mind, on the 5th Earl of Argyll, so the Campbells' relationship with Ireland in mainly the mid-16th century. So again, Professor Dawson is mainly focused on that period of history. Doesn't really say too much on the earlier connections, which are important, or the later connections, but as a case study, it is fantastic on the 5th Earl of Argyll and his relationship with Ireland. Alison Cathcart at Stirling has also written some brilliant stuff, again, case studies looking at James V, his relationship with Ireland, looking at the statutes of Iona, you know, what's happening in Scotland in the early 17th century, what's happening in Ireland at the same time. And Simon Kingston published his PhD back in 2004, which was, I suppose, a comparative study of lordship in Ireland, lordship in Scotland. So again, it did look at the politics to some extent, but it really was a comparative study. Okay, so like what the point I'm trying to make here is nobody yet has really surveyed the politics, the dynastic connections from the early 12th century through to the 17th century. It has been done for cultural connections, but not for the political connections. Okay. Now, as I said, those studies that I just mentioned, they are exceptions. Okay. The main focus thus far has really been on the cultural dynamics underpinning the relationship between Scotland and Ireland. And again, I think it's fair enough to say that in kind of this, from a kind of general point of view, political connections between Ireland and Scotland, the longue durée, if you like, from the 13th century right through to the dawn of the 17th century, they've been reduced to mercenary activity. Mercenaries. That's generally, I can think of several people who should remain nameless. Again, it's been summed up as, oh, it's mercenary contact is the main form of political interaction between Ireland and Scotland. And again, the idea of mercenary, I will talk about this in a little bit more detail later on as well. The idea of what actually is mercenary activity in this period, how do we quantify it, how do we define it? It's been treated, to my mind at least, with kind of varying degrees of imprecision. Okay. So I have, well, 3 key questions. This probably should be 4 key questions because they're 4 bullet points, so my apologies there. I want to remind myself before I've begun. Just from the remainder of the last section of this paper, I want to think about, you know, what kinds of political and dynastic relationships did the Gaelic nobilities of Scotland and Ireland enjoy in the pre-modern period? To what extent, if any, did these political relationships, now not cultural relationships, but do these political relationships foster any sense of Gaelicness? Can we begin then, building on that, can we begin to talk about a greater Gaelic world in a dynastic context? Okay, moving away from a cultural context, is there anything to be said for a dynastic argument? And if so, were the communities of Ireland and Western Scotland aware of such? Again, thinking through a dynastic lens here. So again, the next steps. I want to survey some of the political connections between Ireland and Scotland in this period. So again, what is happening in both regions in the later Middle Ages? And I'd like to reconsider then, based on what we know about some of the cultural dynamics, how can we go about reconsidering those cultural links in light of these political developments? That's kind of what I want. So kind of, I suppose, adding another layer of interpretation to the cultural interface, if you like. Okay, so there are a few maps coming up, and there are animations on the next slide. So they should all work. I hope this works now. So the first point to make out that I want to make here is from kind of early 14th century onwards, the Gaelic aristocracy is becoming more powerful in both regions. Okay. This is largely the result of, you know, the Anglo-Scottish Wars. I won't go, again, we can take questions afterwards, but a combination of factors such as the Anglo-Scottish Wars of the early 14th century, the Little Ice Age, so a cooling of the climate, and the impact of the Black Death, that leads to a softening of English power in Ireland, and it also sees more or less a transformation of landholding in northern Scotland. Who owns what? It creates a power vacuum. Power vacuum in Ireland, power vacuum in the north of Scotland, which is filled by resurgent Gaelic dynasties. Okay, so let's look at Ireland first of all. So the colony anyway retreats to the you can ignore the little territories coloured in grey, kind of that weird kind of pale red colour, and orange for the moment. The colony kind of becomes, it retreats to the eastern seaboard in the course of the 14th and 15th century. So the area in red is that's where the colonial, that's where the heartlands of the English colony in Ireland now lie. We get a vacuum across much of the northern and western seaboards, which is quickly filled over the course of the 14th century by resurgent Gaelic Irish or Gaelicized dynasties. So Gaelicized families who are descended from the 12th century Anglo-Norman or Anglo-French conquerors who become assimilated into the socio-cultural world of Ireland. So in Ulster, we get the Iniel of Tyrone and their clients, so the kind of the lighter blue are their kind of vassals, if you like. We get the Egan of Tyrconnell, modern day Donegal, and their clients in kind of the lighter green. We get the Burke or the Burke lineages in Connacht, so they were the Burg at one stage. They become Gaelicized, they intermarry with the Irish. In this period, they kind of carve up kind of those parts of Connacht between them. And we get the Ivreen of Thomond, okay, down in the south there in purple. Now in Scotland, we have a similar but not identical, right? Really, it's a similar process, but it's not identical to what happens in Ireland. So again, largely because of Robert Bruce's wars and his heirship of Buchan in 1307, 1308, and the ensuing wars with Edward III in the 1330s, the wars of the disinherited, a huge chunk, lots of lordships in the Northern Highlands are destroyed, creating a power vacuum, weakening the power of the central government. So much so Alexander Grant quite memorably summed it up that, you know, from the perspective of the government in Scotland in the 14th century, late 14th century, Scotland's internal frontier was moving significantly to the east. The effectiveness of royal power is retreating in Scotland at the same time. It's different to what happens in Ireland, but broadly speaking, there are some similar factors at play here. Now, we get the rise of the Lordship of the Isles, a hugely powerful entity on Scotland's western seaboard. They become kind of, that's what the preeminent dynasty in the West Highlands and Islands in the kind of the 14th and much of the 15th century. But we also get the rise of the Campbells, the Down Campbell of Argyll at the same time. A little bit later on, they eventually displaced the MacDonalds. So the MacDonalds they operate with a considerable degree of autonomy from the Scottish government. The Campbells, however, they are very much working within the kind of state apparatus, if you like, of the medieval state. Okay, but that's just a couple of the key dynasties I want to highlight in Ireland and Scotland at this time. Now, power within this world, within this Western world, it becomes increasingly concentrated within the regions. So it's rooted in the regions. Michael Brown, Professor of History at St Andrews, he makes a very good point in his book, Disunited Kingdoms, that across not just West Highlands, Islands and Ireland, but across the kind of British Isles more generally, central government in Dublin, London, Edinburgh, Perth, wherever, is becoming more reactive to these developments. It doesn't have control of the situation, and more often than not, the initiative lies with these local communities. So the balance of power has shifted considerably from the 13th century, when it was far easier for the Plantagenets to intervene all the way over as far west as Donegal or Mayo in Ireland, or for, let's say, somebody like Alexander III to demand service from the Hebridean nobility. That's completely changed now. This is not unusual in the European context, okay? We're seeing a softening of royal power all across the continent at this time. Okay, so I just want to say a little bit more, if you like, my first case study on the Lordship of the Isles. So again, a huge amount of scholarship has been completed on the lordship. I'll talk a little bit about, sketch out some of the main contours of the research area. But the MacDonald dynasty, the MacDonald family dynasty, they are the ruling lineage in the Isles at this time, and from about 1336 down to the late 15th century. And at their height, you would have seen in the previous map, and there will be more maps coming up again shortly. At the height of their power, they encompassed the entire Hebridean archipelago, the Earldom of Ross, and a good chunk of the West Highlands in general. They have enjoyed something of a colourful historical reputation, and more often than not, they're perceived as difficult subjects. So, for example, Ted Cowan he had this to say, when Scotland acquires the Hebrides in 1266, he said it was the equivalent of Scotland acquiring its Afghanistan. You know, a region that's impossible to govern, can only end badly. He very much had, I think, the Russian invasion in mind when he was talking about it in the 80s. So again, this idea, it's a problem. It's a problem as well. It's kind of that's a very traditional line of interpretation with regards to the Lordship of the Isles. Now, they've undergone something of a rehabilitation in the last number of years, and the idea of integration, cooperation with the Stewart monarchy has been stressed. So Sonia Cameron said, you know, we should view them as, you know, typical Scottish barons. They behave very badly. Okay, they rebel. That's not unusual in a Scottish context. Look at the House of Douglas. So they behave badly, but again, they're typical. They're no more worse than the other Scottish barons, and they often cooperate with the crown. So they engage with the governance of the realm as well. Now, I would just point out that there has been a lot of work done on the Lordship of the Isles and its development, but the debates don't really engage with Ireland. Okay, there's not really much work done on the Lordship of the Isles and its relationship with Ireland. Now, I mentioned Simon Kingston's book, which is on the MacDonald Lordship in this period, but it was really a comparative study on Lordship in Ireland and Western Scotland. There was a couple of chapters loosely sketching out some political developments, but he was really interested in comparative study on Lordship. And unfortunately, he missed the idea that the Lordship is very much plugged into Irish affairs. The Lordship of the Isles, throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, it drew a lot of its strength from Ireland. So again, diplomacy. So the Eniail, the O'Neills of Tyrone, they're often engaging with them, trying to build alliances with them. They marry into the Eniail family as well. They're engaged in Irish warfare. They have allies. They're also involved in significant cultural patronage in Ireland. So again, bardic poetry. At least, is it 2 poems attributed? There's a number of poems. There's at least 2 poems, there's maybe 3 in this period, written for Lords of the Isles by Irish bards. And part of MS 1467, the great MacDonald's genealogical history, and there's various bits and pieces. And part of that is actually patronised by the Butlers of Ormond, one of the leading English dynasties in Ireland, which is interesting. So again, and that's right down in Tipperary. So the Lordship is very much plugged in politically, culturally, dynastically to Ireland. But again, it's something that's rarely mentioned in the main studies. The Lordship of the Isles' enemies, they are also involved in Irish affairs. So the Campbells of Argyll, the Stewarts, they ally themselves with the O'Donnells of the Egan of Tyrconnell in this period as well, the Green dynasty and kind of modern day Donegal. So what I kind of want to highlight there is there are well-established dynastic connections. This is just taking the example of the Lordship of the Isles. Okay, the Lordship needs to be understood as being, you know, when we look at its lifespan, why it has a particular lifespan, we need to factor Ireland into that. It draws a lot of its strength from Ireland, and Ireland also helps bring it down. The O'Donnells, the Egan will play an important role later on in bringing the Lordship down in the 1490s. Okay. Just want to talk a little bit about the mercenary trade. I have one more case study after this. The mercenary trade, it's primarily understood as 2 distinct phases of mercenary activity. So we've got the permanent Galloglass migration from the late 13th century. It seems to stop around 1370 then. So that's when you have families uprooted from Western Scotland that migrate westwards. They settle, they acquire lands in Irish lordships, and they serve as hereditary Galloglass, hereditary fighters for their new masters. the MacSweeneys, the Macsivn, the dynasty, they go and they settle in Tir Conal. You can see them on the little map there, up in the cute little men with their axes. There you go. So it's a permanent relocation of kindreds from the West Highlands to Ireland. That stops before the end of the 14th century. The second phase then is the red shank, the seasonal red shank, which is warriors go and fight in Ireland on a seasonal basis every year. So they go to Ireland, then they return home. So that's how it's largely been understood. Two very distinct phases. Very much a one-way movement of troops from Scotland into Ireland. The Irish aristocracy is often seen as hapless and in desperate need for Scottish military support. And the mercenary activity is very much understood as, material gain. The literal definition of a mercenary. That's how quite a few scholars have understood it. There's just some very quick key considerations to take into account. Seasonal. There's nothing unique about the Tudor periods. It's there if you go looking for it. Seasonal forms of recruitment were in existence for centuries, and it's not just one way. Scottish lords recruited from Ireland as well. Now, it does become more one way over time, but like throughout the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, we do have Irish troops going to Scotland, or troops from Scotland that have come to Ireland going back home again. We also have some further evidence in 1513 and 1556, which I won't go into because I'm conscious of the time. I mentioned earlier on the term mercenary, and this is a modern term scholars have applied, that has been treated with varying degrees of imprecision. What do we actually mean by mercenary? Do we mean a hired gun or some kind of a freelancer? Again, there's no word really for that in Irish. There's a couple of terms. There's Shershinach, which is maybe a borrowing from sergeant, and there's Buana, which a billeted troop. So again, these just mean troops that are quartered on local populations. Okay, it doesn't mean hired gun or anything like. The primary meaning just means troop that is somebody that's quartered on a local population. The Lord has put them there. The locals have to feed him, look after him. That's all it means. It seems anyway. And it seems to have been relatively impossible for an Irish lord to recruit Scottish troops, to recruit mercenaries from Scotland without some form of dynastic arrangement. Okay, there's not really any evidence for people. People may have left Scotland and approached Irish lords on their own, but generally speaking, most of the evidence that I've consulted, large bodies of troops are secured through dynastic arrangements, okay, through marriage or through pre-existing alliance networks. The mercenary trade, if you want to call it the mercenary trade, the military trade is far more regulated than we give it credit for. There's a couple of examples there, which I don't really have time to go into, but there is evidence for it. Okay, coming to the end. The last case study I want to touch upon very briefly, is this idea of sovereignty. So Stephen Ellis remarked in his 1999 article that the evidence concerning the development of wider concepts of power and identity in the late medieval Gaeltacht points towards the emergence of a consolidated Gaelic kingdom spanning the North Channel rather than a revived High Kingship of Ireland. So again, he was arguing that, in the evidence according to Ellis in the later medieval period was that the Irish and Scots were maybe thinking about some kind of a union, or they were aspiring to a greater Gaelic sovereignty. This has been quite challenged very cogently by Martin McGregor, who says there is no evidence to support this. He has instead argued that sovereignties, at least in Scotland, need to be understood in distinctly regional contexts. Okay, so he's taken the example of Canis Gael or Canis na Gael. There's an N missing from now there. Canis na Gael, which is this idea of the headship of the Gaels. He says that you have this high poetic concept in late medieval Scotland, and he says that has nothing really to do with Ireland. It's about Clondonal, Clancaimble rivalry between the MacDonalds and the Campbells in the later Middle Ages. So again, this idea of a greater Gaelic sovereignty is nonsensical, according to MacGregor. It says it needs Canis na Gael is one example that should be understood in a Scottish context. But is this idea of regional sovereignty unique to Ireland? Sorry, unique to Scotland. What about Ireland? It's a well-known fact that Irish, in kind of the pre-1260, up until 1260, the Irish lords aspire to a high kingship of the entire island. But by 1260, that is more or less dead. It's more or less, it's no longer a gore. And there's little evidence that Irish dynasts, Irish kings, Irish lords aspire to it after 1260. It's instead offered to foreign rulers. So again, we've got Hakon IV of Norway in 1263. He's offered a high kingship. Edward Bruce, the most famous, is offered it in 1513, and possibly James V in 1540. Excuse me. Alison Cathcart has written about that. So if the high kingship is dead, what do Irish lords actually aspire to? What are they looking towards? Is there anything similar to Canis na Gael in an Irish context? There is, I think so. Catherine Sims, her kind of groundbreaking book, From Kings to Warlords, she demonstrated that the idea of kingship in Ireland, it dies out gradually. Gradually is the key word, and is eventually replaced with notions of lordship. So the idea of a ri or a king becomes, a tierna, a lord. Rigacht, kingship, becomes tierness, lordship, over time. And there are a couple of key characteristics, so underpinning this. So lordships become more militarized. There's more soldiers. There's more warfare. We get the ubiquitous presence of mercenaries. Again, she uses that expression. And again, power becomes concentrated in the region, in the various regions of Ireland. Now, there is this idea, and I should point out that the exercise of lordship in Ireland is often perceived to have been a very localized affair, so parochial in some ways. Power was rooted in the locality. That's important. A powerful family like the Eniel or the Egonal, their power is based in a region, a particular region, but some of them are able to wield power on a much wider scale. And we can see this from, marriage alliances and diplomacy, military campaigns, and also the pursuit of titles or territorial hegemonies rooted in titles. I just want to give you a couple of quick examples. Princeps Tony, Prince of Ulster, dates the 14th and 15th century, and it's what the Eniel use when it's what they style themselves in correspondence with Richard II when he comes to Ireland in the 1390s, and Richard, Duke of York, in the 1440s. And you can see from the map that does reflect their territorial hegemony in blue. Everything in Ulster, bar the dark blue there up in Antrim, that is within their lordship, if you like. The use of prince is interesting. We're possibly seeing some Renaissance influence there. Rex Legenii, King of Leinster. So we still have king in the 14th and 15th centuries. That's Art MacMurrough Cuevánach, who dies in 1417. This is used, he has a seal that has the Latin inscription Rex Legenii on it. Richard II acknowledges him thus. And again, it reflects his power base in Leinster. You can see the kind of turquoisey green there. Possibly my favourite, the Macwilliam or Macwilliam. This is a patronymic denoting ancestry from William de Burgh, who was the first colonial lord of Connacht. Now again, the de Burgh lordship, it fragments in 1333 and splits in Connacht at least into two main lordships. We've got the Burcha of Eachter Connacht, so that's Mayo in the north, and the Burcha of Uachtar Connacht, Galway in the south. Both of these lineages, the kind of orange one and the purple one, the yellow one and the orange one, they struggle for this title of Macwilliam, a Macwilliamship, and it reflects the desire to be the head of their dynasty, of the entire Burke dynasty. So they have two separate kindreds, but whoever holds the title of Macwilliam, they are recognised as the head of what is left of the de Burgh dynasty. in Connacht, in Ireland in general. So you're a regional hegemon. That's important, I think, at this time again. So again, they are of Anglo-French ancestry, but they're embedded in Irish affairs. My final example for these kind of titles, Ri Lechuin, King of Con's Half. So this is an ancient division of Ireland, and it denotes the northern half of Ireland above the kind of Esker-Reda line, which is kind of basically a line from Galway to Dublin. Geographically, that's what we can think of. So Con's Half, it comes from Con Cé Cathach, Con of the 100 Battles, kind of a legendary high king of Ireland. The southern half is Le Moor, Mog's half, the southern half of Ireland. Does anyone try to claim this? Does anyone try to claim the northern half of Ireland as their own? Yeah, A. Dubh O'Donnell, who dies in 1537. There's a genealogy that lists him as Ri Lechuin, King of Con's Half. Obviously, genealogies are propaganda in this period, but this is reflected in his regional supremacy. Look at how the map changes. By 1510, he was the most powerful dynasty in Ireland. All those territories are paying him tribute. Okay, he's unchallenged in Ulster. Most of northern Connacht is paying him tribute. He's an ally of James IV of Scotland. He also writes to Henry VIII in 1514, styling himself as Prince O'Donnell. We get that use of prince again. A Renaissance man. Okay. Right, I'm very nearly finished, Andrew, I promise. Just one or two more slides, just one or two other things. I'm kind of flying a little bit of a kite here for these. You might say I've been flying a kite all along, but I'm very conscious I'm flying a kite here for these last couple of slides. This is just something I've been working on recently. Is there any evidence that a Gaeltacht actually existed, this idea of a Gaeltacht? Ellis says, yes, there was, but he doesn't point to any direct evidence. Christopher McGinn claims there is only one reference to it in Irish material, actual historical evidence for a Gaeltacht, the Annals of Ulster in 1488. They have an obituary for Henry O'Shalvey, the best singer in the Gaeltacht of Con's Half. Again, what should we make of this? The Gaeltacht of Con's Half. Gaeltacht is mentioned, and it's the Gaelic part of the Gaelic peoples of the Gaelic district, the Gaelic-speaking district of the northern half of Ireland. It's not expressing a pan-Gaelic world. It's referring to the northern half of Ireland. But again, can we make anything more of that? I don't know is the short answer. Do we have any other references to Gaeltacht? And if so, does it include Scotland? There's one very quick source I've just came across recently. The Cothrim Porialvig. It's the Triumphs of Turlough. It's a historical epic, we call it. It's a mid-14th century biography of Turlough Moore O'Brien, who was the King of Thomond in 1306, and some of his descendants. And it recounts their struggles with the De Clare. So in modern day County Clare, Thomond, the Shannon estuary. It's primarily an account of that war between the Ivrian and the De Clares. But there is also a section on the Bruce invasions, and there is a Scottish dimension to the text. When the Bruces and Scots got that far south, they pop up in the text. Now, one passage focuses on the civil war between Turlough's or Turialvig's descendants, and it notes the following: Bod scéal gúsachta don Gaeltacht in Grin scéal sin. So again, my very loose translation, my apologies. That true serious tale of civil war should serve as an important tale for maybe the people of the Gaeltacht. Okay, again, is he just talking about Ireland here? Is he talking about something wider? We do have Scots popping up in the text. I don't know. I think it's interesting that this term pops up here as well. Now, it goes on to say then that this feud between the O'Brien, within the Ivrian dynasty, the Ivrian fighting one another would only benefit the English, giving them a cat dun lascaliv gach gaeltir. Again, my loose translation. The civil war will give the English a chapter for all the countries of the Gael. Again, I don't know. I just thought that was quite interesting. But like I said, the text focuses on events in the Shannon estuary. It is a work of dynastic propaganda, but the author is fully cognizant of the Scottish presence in Ireland, the Bruce invasions. And it does locate the Iverine Civil War in a wider Gaelic context. Was this unique? Again, was this again, I don't know, has anyone done the work on that? Like, how did Gaelic authors in texts like the Cothrame, how did they conceive of, were they thinking about a greater Gaelic world, or is it just is that just our imagination? I don't know. Okay, very last slide, and I'll shut up then. So some of the conclusions I hope to draw from this paper. Now, Ireland and Scotland, at the very least, they have a complex relationship in the pre-modern era. Okay, that relationship has primarily, not exclusively, but primarily been understood through a cultural lens. It is a very insightful lens. It's told us a huge amount, but it is just one side of the coin. These cultural links, these evolving, changing, even divergent cultural links, they sat atop a variety of dynastic and political undercurrents. And this is what I want to take away. While Ireland and Scotland, they might have been diverging culturally and linguistically, and they seem to have been. Dynastic links, they ensured an ongoing, and in some cases perhaps intensifying interface. Okay? So cultural linguistic divergence, but political interactions remain very, very strong. Okay? The links, the political links, they really only end, if we can even say they've ended, but they really only end in the 17th century, and we're talking post-Cromwellian conquest. That's when the Gaelic Irish order is obliterated. It's still there up until the 1640s, but in post-Cromwell basically does away with it. Okay, and again, that's a political development, not a cultural one. It takes essentially Cromwell, to my mind, to break that nexus once and for all. Cultural, linguistic divergence, yes, I think that argument holds up. But again, you still have these really strong political connections that must go some way to holding those cultural links together as well. But again, that's a story for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. There was no chance I was pulling you in there. I was enjoying that too much. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots of questions. We've already got a couple in the chat. So we'll kick off with Mairead's throwing you a bit of grenade as a first question. Unionist learners of Irish in Belfast often draw on the notion of a common Scottish-Irish Gaelic cultural history to promote Irish as a language for all. Would you, how would the dynastic connections you've outlined strengthen or weaken that argument?
I suppose it kind of depends. Yeah, I can certainly see how a kind of the Scottish element in particular would be attracted to people. People from a unionist background perhaps who would kind of they would feel that learning Irish, they're tapping into something that's much older than the kind of sectarian communities perhaps. But how would a dynastic connections outline or strengthen? I don't know. I think partly because of the history of sectarianism to some extent, and you obviously have sectarian elements in Scotland, those political connections are quite, they're maybe a bit raw still. So I don't know if dynastic connections, talking about them, would lend much weight, convincing someone to say, come on and study Irish, maybe leave it for the culture stuff for the moment. That's what I would think anyway.
Yeah. Obviously, you've got things like plantation and Reformation and things that obviously colour that as well.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Blair Matthews. What is the role of the Norse or the legacy of Norse networks in linking the Gaelic world?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. Well, I suppose it's in 1263 I mentioned that King Haakon is offered the High Kingship of Ireland by the Crahur, the O'Connors of Connaught. And Haakon has an awful lot of support from the Hebridean nobility at this time, so it's kind of the ancestors of the Lords of the Isles. So, like, the Norse have been driven from Ireland. I mean, by about 1170-71, most of the Norse towns in Ireland are now taken by the English. So we're talking almost 100 years later. You still have this Norse element, and that Norse element is very focused on, it still has Hebridean subjects, and those Hebridean subjects are still plugged into Ireland throughout the 13th century. So yeah, certainly in the century after Dublin and basically Norse, the Ostman towns in Ireland falling, that Hebridean connection, it still allows for, it still provides a conduit to Scandinavian affairs, and that conduit also seems to complement relationships between Ireland and Scotland at that time, I think anyway.
Okay. We've got a question from Grace Proudfoot. How does the flight of the Earls fit into the picture you've outlined?
Really good question. I suppose how does it? The flight of the Earls is very interesting because there's been a lot written on it in terms of what were the motivations for Hugh O'Neill and Rory O'Donnell fleeing to the continent. Hugh O'Neill was supposed to, as far as I remember it, it was either his son or his daughter was supposed to marry the daughter or son of the Earl of Argyll. There was supposed to be a new dynastic relationship between the post Treaty of Mellifont in 1603. There was supposed to be a new alliance between Hugh O'Neill, who had been pardoned for his rebellion against the Tudors. There was supposed to be a new union that would have again, it would have just sat atop pre-existing connections between Ireland and Scotland, and it would have increased the Campbells' leverage in Ireland. So the flight of the Earls does, the fact that they up and leave so quickly in 1607, they are under serious pressure, which again, David Edwards wrote a very interesting chapter called "The Plight of the Earls," which just does, it talks about, and it's a terrible pun, just the sheer levels of pressure that the Earls were under. So again, especially Hugh O'Neill, had the marriage gone ahead, he may have had more protection under the Earl of Argyll, under that kind of Campbell umbrella, but it doesn't happen. But it is something really interesting, something that kind of needs to be looked at in more detail. I do know, read Hugh O'Donnell's biography, Baha Éarua. There is a section in that which talks about when Rory Moore MacLeod brings a force of Redshanks basically to help Red Hugh O'Donnell in 1594 to siege Enniskillen. There's a section in it which talks about the strangeness of the Hebridean Scots from the Outer Hebrides, the strangeness of their language, and oftentimes that's held up as an example of, oh look, the Irish didn't, and I mean that again, that's a clear example of propaganda, because it's a product of the Counter-Reformation, that text. It's written in Louvain in the early 17th century. And the author, Lugo Clary, he does the same thing to the English. He others them. So I think I think we have to be really careful when we get to the late 16th, early 17th century. There's some evidence, I think, that is overstated, overused, that historians have used to kind of prove a certain amount of divergence, when in actual fact we're dealing with Reformation politics and state formation, very nasty Tudor state formation, and the Irish very much want to make a case that they want help from the Spanish, and they're willing to kind of big up the Catholicism of the Irish and downplay their links with maybe Protestant Scotland at this time. So I think it's a really interesting question. Sorry, I've gone off on a massive tangent, but definitely the flight of the Earls is it is very much within that context.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the Reformation changes a lot of things in that dynamic, and that's almost a completely separate topic. We've got a couple questions from Michael Newton. I'll maybe paraphrase some of these just because he's added some thoughts as he's gone on. He's asked, how do you see the efforts of the Earl of Argyll to underwrite the translation of the Book of Common Prayer in classical Gaelic in a way that explicitly was pan-Gaelic or pan-Gaelic in focus? Doesn't that acknowledge the wider cultural province, or at least its potential?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And again, it's something that I think historians could have made placed more emphasis on. The fifth Earl of Argyll and the fourth are actually pretty much from the second Earl of Argyll. Well, that's when we have good evidence. But definitely from the second Earl of Argyll onwards, we have increasing evidence for their involvement in Irish affairs, particularly Ulster. And the famous marriages in 1569, where the fifth Earl of Argyll marries his aunt Agnes Campbell to Turlough Lunach O'Neill, and there's a suggestion, I can't remember, but I think Turlough Lunach gives money to Trinity College. No, is it I think it's Turlock and Agnes. They give money, they donate money to the foundation of Trinity College Dublin, a Protestant foundation, which is really interesting. I think it's now again, to what extent is that just politics, playing politics in Ireland? But I think that is interesting. But yeah, absolutely. Like kind of Protestantism within the Gaeltacht, or Calvinism. Jane Dawson's written about that in the Scottish context. But again, the big success story in Ireland for a Gaelic family that became Protestant are the Ivrian. They become the Earls of Thomond. They give up their 24-carat bloodline, going back all the way back to Breen Brew, and they, now so they manage to navigate. They do it well enough. Like they survive the Tudors, which I suppose is good going, but they get absolutely battered then in the 17th century. But their Protestantism protects them from the worst excesses of Tudor and then Stewart government in Ireland in the later 16th and early 17th century. But it's a really good question, Michael. I think that is definitely, like, especially from the Campbells, how the preeminent Scottish dynasty in the 16th century, this preeminent Gaelic Scottish dynasty, how they maybe conceive of that Western world. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, Michael's just added a couple of comments on that, just about the degree of consciousness of a kind of a pan-Gaelic or pan-Gaelic world in vernacular Scottish Gaelic oral narratives well into the 19th century onwards. Okay. We've got a question from Susie Collier. Would you consider the earlier political and religious connections between Ireland and Scotland, such as the Gael, and earlier monastic connections, to strengthen this argument about long-lasting political connections?
Yes, because I think it's those earlier connections, the later connections, all very much sit on top of this. And I suppose if you go back to, let's say, the pre-invasion Ireland to the 12th century, like you have the various lords, and you have the Dublin, Waterford, they're very much plugged into, like, the Irish Sea world is configured in a way that it's kind of a super highway extending all the way up to Orkney, Shetland, and Scandinavia. And the Irish, the various communities of, let's say, the Irish rulers in Ulster, Leinster, you've got the lords of Galloway, Western Scotland more generally, they're all very much plugged into all of this. So let's say, kind of, I suppose, monastic connections very much sit within that kind of cultural milieu there. And again, like the expansion of, as I would see it anyway, of English government, of Anglo-Norman, we would call it English government, from kind of 1169 onwards. It's a slow, gradual process. It takes almost 100 years for English lordship to become established as far west as kind of Donegal and places. So within that time, these various connections, Galloway becomes really important in all of this. Like the Lords of Galloway are kind of contracted by the English to kind of intervene in kind of Western Ulster and Connaught places. So I think I think those early connections are like, I haven't looked at them in any huge detail, but from kind of 12th century was kind of where I picked things up. You do see that what happens in the 12th century, what happens in the later Middle Ages is clearly built on what happens in the 12th century. What happens in the 12th century is clearly following a well-established path that was set much earlier, I think.
We've got time for a couple more questions, then we'll give Simon a well-earned rest. Got a question from Leith Davis. Fascinating talk, thank you. I'm just wondering what the implications of your research might have for the historiography that is more inclusive of women's roles. I'm particularly thinking of your focus on dynastic connections in particular. That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. That is really important, I think, because why we've missed so much is because often historians were not paying enough attention to the role of women in all of this, or the women aren't there in the sources. So there's some very, very important marriage. I mean, there's one marriage, for example, that 1259, Egan Crochúr, son of the King of Connaught, he marries the unnamed daughter of Dougal MacRory of Garmoran, one of the most powerful Hebridean warlords. We don't know her name. She becomes the Queen of Connaught a few years later, a hugely influential figure. And I think that's one example of we've got a Scottish Queen of Connaught, and I think that's something really, it was something that was pointed out by a former colleague of mine at Trinity that said, you've got a Scottish Queen of Connaught there. So I've never thought of things like that, like what kind of level of influence does, again, she's unnamed, I can't find her name in any of the genealogies, I think that's fascinating. That is a really important point, and obviously we should pay much more, much more attention to women's role in all of this. Another example I can think of is I mentioned William de Burgh, the first Lord of Connaught, who dies in 1205. He marries the unnamed daughter of Donald More O'Brien around 1193. Um, Up until literally yesterday, I couldn't find a name for her, but I found it in an appendix in a chapter by Freya Verstraeten Veitch. It's on the very last page in the appendix. She found the name in a manuscript in the National Library. Her name is Anya. So what really struck me then was that's William de Burgh married Anya. All the Burghs in Ireland are descended from that union, that marriage. That goes all the way down to Richard Duke of York, Edward IV, and Richard III. They all have Irish blood. So Edward IV can trace his ancestry, which I think is again another. If you didn't think about that, so absolutely, really hugely important.
Yeah, really changes the picture quite a lot actually when you think about it like that. We've got a question from Patrick Warden. Thanks, Simon. Really interesting. Are there dynastic links between Gaelic Ireland and Gaelic Scotland any stronger than similar relationships, marriage, etc., between Gaelic, Irish, and the English of Ireland? If not, what does that suggest about the relative significance of Gaeldom as a community?
Thanks, Patrick. That's again a very interesting question. I suppose it depends on what kind of relation, again, how we categorize these relationships. So we just think about we think about marriage first of all. So you have a family like the Butlers or the Fitzgeralds of Kildare, who were very heavily intermarried with the Irish aristocracy in the 15th and then 16th centuries. And by and large, that's to preserve or uphold English government in Ireland. So marriage is used as a tool to underprop or extending. Certainly with the Butlers, the Fitzgeralds are a bit maybe more on the fence. But the Butlers, if you look at somebody like Black Tom Butler in the late 16th century, he's married to all these different. Well, he has children with lots of women he's not married to, but he also has his own illegitimate children. He marries them into different groups, and that's so just. From a purely statistical point of view, there's a huge amount of evidence for English intermarriage with the Irish, but certainly on the eastern seaboard, that's designed to preserve governance, preserve the lordship, protect the lordship of Ireland. Ireland and Scotland, one of the really frustrating problems we have is that evidence for marriage can be quite difficult to excavate. We have various. You do see statistically far more intermarriage between the Butlers and the Irish than you would, let's say, the Lordship of the Isles and the Irish. But again, it's a different kind of relationship. So again, the records are better preserved from an English point of view as well. So again, it does. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, but I think it is. We are talking about different sets of relationships. I mean, one example is so what's his name? Garrod Earl. He's one of the I see the third or fourth Earl of Desmond in the late 14th century. He has poetry that ends up in the Book of the Dean Lismore. Now he's literally beyond the pale in Westminster. Doesn't pay his taxes. Doesn't really give a damn about the crown. Some of his poetry ended up in Scotland. Catherine Sims has postulated that there was a big gathering of poets, I think, in the 1360s, 1370s, and that may be how his poems transmitted all the way over to Scotland. So again, he's a colonial lord who seems to have some kind of connection with Scotland, but there's no marriage links. So again, I think how we think about these relationships is really significant. But I'm not sure how to calculate. It's a very good question. I'll be thinking about it later tonight again. Now I won't sleep.
I think I might abuse my host privileges to ask you one last question, Simon. Just about the kind of role that the English-speaking world plays in this, and the kind of othering of Irish and Scottish Gaeldom, because in the Scottish context, you get references well into the 18th century about barbaric Gaels. You get references, people obviously speaking Scots Gaelic in Scotland, but it's always referred to as Irish. So there's always this kind of almost unconscious linkage from the centre or the state's point of view to push these two peoples apart. Does that create, is that something that they're picking up on, and they see this link and that is tangible for them, or is that almost creating this kind of synthetic framework, which is really difficult to then unpick from our perspective because of the, the lack of Scots Gaelic and Irish sources.
I suppose so. So I mean, from the perspective of the Gaelic peoples themselves, is it, or from the perspective of the state?
From our perspective, trying to trying to identify if there is a this
Yeah.
Gaelic world.
It is, because I think like we've gotten what I think new British history did a lot of damage in how we think about relationships in the pre-modern world, in the pre-modern archipelago. So people like kind of Robin Frame, Rhys Davies, who wrote that kind of they import, like, it's very helpful if you're studying these kind of if you're looking at the expansion of English power. But and oftentimes the Gaelic parts of the archipelago are lumped into this kind of superstructure where, yes, they're obviously part of the various communities, but it can be very hard. There hasn't been much attempt really to disentangle it and think about it in a terrible amount of detail, or there hasn't really been much of an effort to kind of offer a Gaelic model of, let's say, British history. It's like I said, there's been a lot of work done on the cultural connections. So again, and how historic, maybe it would be a good idea for us to step out of looking at Ireland's relationship with Scotland, if we put it into a wider framework that's more sympathetic to the Gaelic point of view, rather than putting it into an Anglo-centric framework, which is what people generally do. We might be able to see things in new lights. But you're right. It is. Yeah, I think oftentimes how we think of things, it can be quite artificial, and it can be very much skewed by how some very influential historians have approached the topic. But again, like I said, I think Robin Frame did make a very good point in one of his writings that Irish and Scottish historians have been quite content to tend their gardens in isolation from one another. And I think there is something kind of to be said for that as well, especially from kind of a politics point of view. Like I said, it's not scholarship in Ireland. Oftentimes it's looking at the relationship between Gaelic aristocracy and maybe the Tudor state, or once you're getting into the 16th century, 17th century, it's Ireland's relationship with the kind of Catholic Europe. And again, Scotland, then again, it's with the Stewart state, or it might be looking at the 30 Years' War recruitment. So you do have, like, they are very obvious, perhaps more attractive subjects to look at as well. You can go out and do your research in Simancas and drink loads of wine and be nice and warm. You don't want to go to Edinburgh and freeze. So I think I think kind of, methodologically, there's a lot of kind of baggage there, and there's a lot of kind of just value judgments made about how we should go about doing things. And I think that has been to the detriment of the subject, because especially once you get to the 16th and 17th century, we have an abundance of material to work with. I mean, like I'm thinking even English materials, state papers. You have a huge amount of spies reports that are like, it's like reading a newspaper for what's going on in the Irish Sea, what's going on in the North Channel, which can tell us an awful lot about. Again, it's English material, but oftentimes it's very good. But again, that is quite neglected because there are other research priorities. I think so.
Well, that's probably an ideal point at which to wrap things up. Thank you very much, Simon. The last couple of things that I've just got to do before I bring everything to an end. First and foremost, I would like everyone to join in with the traditional awkward virtual round of applause for Simon's fantastic paper and his great generosity in the discussion. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much, folks. Thanks for listening.
You've just got to imagine that 60 people are clapping just now. Now, before everyone jumps off to enjoy the rest of their evening, I've just got a quick service announcement, and that's that next month we were meant to have our final seminar of the series, courtesy of Dr. Andrew Jennings, but we're having to reschedule that because of a conflict that's come up because of another event. So a decision will be made shortly about what to do with that seminar. It will run at some point. We just haven't decided exactly when it will run. So do keep your eyes peeled on the INS website and on our Twitter page for updates. But until then, thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your excellent questions. And most of all, thanks to Simon for a fantastic paper. And we will see you all next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, folks.